How will we address the climate crisis? Climate One with Greg Dalton brings together advocates, influencers, and policymakers in empowering conversations that connect all aspects of the climate emergency, the individual and the systemic, the scary and the exciting, to help you understand the most critical issue of our time. Because addressing the climate crisis begins by talking about it.
No elemental force has done more to shape life on this planet than water. From originating the earliest forms of life, to sculpting our landscapes, to determining patterns of human civilization, humans have tried to control water for thousands of years, and access to this precious resource has caused conflict and also unlikely partnerships. In an era defined by climate disruption, the control, access, and quality of water will continue to determine our ability to survive and thrive. Peter Gleick, co-founder of the Pacific Institute and author of The 3 Ages of Water, joins us to discuss this and more today on Climate One. As humanity progressed, so did our ability to control water. So much so that today we mostly consider ourselves insulated against oversupply or shortage. And yet, every year, we see examples of how fragile this control really is, especially in our climate-amplified world. So how well do you think we're currently managing our relationship with water?
There are all sorts of climate and water-related crises. We take water for granted. And the history of water tells us that we could and should be doing better than we're doing now.
And there are examples in the past of doing better, would you say?
Well, there's certainly examples in the past of doing better. But in the first age of water, this sort of prehistory, it didn't matter as much. Populations of the planet were very small. We took water where we found it, and we dumped our wastes where we could. And it didn't really matter. Life was pretty miserable anyway, and brutal and short. But that early era of water really helped define humanity. It helped sort of set the stage for where we are today.
And today, and I think this has actually been true for quite a long time, about 80% of the water we use goes to grow food. And yet cities are growing, our populations are growing, we need more and more water. We've seen major advances in irrigation technology, but I would say fewer shifts to less water-consumptive crops, especially in states like my home state, Arizona, where cotton and alfalfa are still mainstay crops. How can we maintain our agricultural economies and food production while using a little bit less water, or a lot less water?
Well, this is a key, of course. As you say, 80% of the water that humans use worldwide goes to grow food. That's partly a result of the green revolution that happened in the last century, where we learned really the importance of irrigated water for agriculture. And there's a food crisis as well as a water crisis. Hundreds of millions of people go to bed hungry every day today, and populations continue to grow. And part of the question is, how are we going to continue to grow enough food with the water supplies that are already overtapped? How can we grow more food? How can we meet our needs with less water?
And are there going to be, do you think that there's a receptive audience for some of these changes in the U.S.? Just speaking to the U.S. and the amount of power the agricultural lobby has, there's a lot of water that goes to grow things that we don't eat. It goes to grow food for cows or food for other animals. Do you see a future where that changes, where we take some of that water for other uses?
Well, it depends on who you mean by a receptive audience. In general, people really care about water. If you look at public opinion polls about the environment that have gone back for many, many decades, access to safe water and the availability of water and protecting the quality of our water has always been right at the top of those public opinion polls. People care about water. And in terms of changing the way we do what we do, it depends on who we're asking to change and what the benefits are. We already see farmers growing more food with less water. When there's a shortage of water, there's pressure on water resources, then farmers think, well, what can I do differently? How can I do what I want with less water? So we see that in California, we see that around the world. There are changes in irrigation practices now that are moving us in the right direction. But laws and water rights and institutions are sometimes very hard to change and sometimes very slow to change.
We have already seen stretches of U.S. farmland go out of production because wells have gone dry, groundwater wells. And here in California, the pumping has gotten either too expensive and also led to ground subsidence. What will happen to these regions when it just becomes impossible to pump any more water? Will they recover? Will we see them recover?
So this is, again, where history sort of is interesting to me. In the first age of water, we didn't think about irrigation. We grew crops once agriculture was invented, where water was reliable, where there was reliable rain, where there were reliable rivers in ancient Mesopotamia, in the Indus Valley, in India, in China. But as populations grew and as we outgrew those local water resources, we had to think differently about where to get our water. And today, a vast amount of our agricultural water comes from groundwater, something that was not possible a long time ago, and that really resulted from the Green Revolution. Today, a lot of the crops that we grow are grown with what I describe as non-renewable groundwater. That is, we pump groundwater faster than nature recharges it. And like oil, when you pump something faster than nature recharges it, the stocks go down, it becomes harder and harder to find it, it becomes more expensive to use it, and in the long run, it's not sustainable. And that's the agricultural crisis today. A substantial amount, maybe 30 or 40% of the world's food production comes from non-renewable groundwater, and it simply can't continue. Groundwater levels are dropping. It's happening in California, it's happening in the Great Plains, northern China, India. We have to think about how to replace that water, how to grow more food with less water. That's, again, part of the challenge.
One of the really interesting things I learned from your book is that groundwater pumped from aquifers eventually ends up in the oceans and actually contributes to sea level rise. And this larger point of water being, the supply is continuous, is constant, but we just kind of move it around. And in a way, we've moved so much of it around in this maybe second age of water that we've really changed the dynamics. And so can you tell us a bit more about that? Because I thought that was news to me.
Yeah, that's right. There's renewable water resources, the rivers that flow, the rain that falls, the hydrologic cycle that we all remember from elementary school. And there's non-renewable water, the groundwater resources that have been laid down over thousands or tens of thousands of years, and that are a stock there, but that when you use them, get used up. When we use groundwater and take groundwater out of that stock and put it on crops, it goes back to evaporation, it runs off back to the oceans. Strangely enough, it contributes a little bit to sea level rise because you're moving a stock from underground into the renewable hydrologic cycle.
Well, so this second age of water is what you define as our current age. And this has been defined by advances in engineering that have essentially replumbed the entire planet and brought along unintended consequences, pollution, ecological disruption, conflict, climate change, and then a term that you use, water poverty. Can you define that for us and tell us how that's impacting women and girls around the world especially?
So water poverty is, what I mean by that is simply the failure today to provide everyone on the planet with safe water and sanitation, and the inequities we see in the way our water systems and institutions have been developed. The second age of water was really an age when we discovered what water was. We discovered what oxygen was and hydrogen and the molecule that makes up water. It was the scientific revolutions that helped us build the water systems that we have today, that let us build aqueducts not a few kilometers long out of dirt as we did in ancient times, but hundreds or thousands of kilometers long and through mountains, and build the huge dams that provide water and flood control and drought protection and hydropower, and the smart systems that help deliver to us safe water and sanitation, the things most of us take for granted. You know, the idea that we can turn on our tap and have incredibly cheap, incredibly pure water delivered to us is something many of us in the sort of richer part of the world take for granted. But there are billions of people today worldwide that don't have access to safe water and sanitation. And that's really what I define as water poverty.
And even in the US, as you said, where tap water is almost always safe to drink, we have underinvested in our public water supplies, so much so that we need to repair and replace most of our infrastructure in the next 15 years, and we don't have really the funds to do it. Has that changed with the infrastructure law and the Inflation Reduction Act and the infusion of money that we've seen from those?
It has, to some degree. That's another important part about water poverty. You know, we take it for granted that those of us in the wealthier part of the world have safe water and sanitation. But that's true only as long as we invest in our water systems. And the disaster in Flint, Michigan a few years ago, where a good water system went bad because of underinvestment and mismanagement, and the disaster today in Jackson, Mississippi, and the communities in the Central Valley that don't have access to safe water still, and the Native American communities that have never had access to safe water in this country. Water poverty is not just a problem in the developing world, it's a problem here. And part of it is the failure to provide safe water and sanitation to those communities, but part of it is, as you say, the failure to continue to invest in the water systems that we have. We're not adequately investing in upgrading and maintaining our urban water systems in most places. That leads to things like Flint, Michigan, and Jackson, the failure in Jackson, Mississippi. The Inflation Reduction Act, passed by Congress and signed by President Biden, provides a lot of money for water, provides a lot of money for all sorts of infrastructure in the US, which is great. It provides $15 billion, for example, to remove lead pipes. It provides money for investing in new water systems and upgrading water systems. So it is a step forward. A lot of that money ought to come from our own pockets. You know, we pay water bills. That water goes to our water utilities. Those water utilities are responsible for maintaining and upgrading our urban systems, but they haven't been maintained the way they ought to be.
Well, this is one thing you also write about in the book, this sort of necessity that you argue to continue investing in our public water supplies as opposed to privatizing them. And maybe can you kind of explain that argument and maybe the problems that might come from privatization of water?
And that can be defined in a lot of different ways. Bottled water is a way to privatize public water systems as well. In the US, most of our water utilities are public, and they've always been public. A small fraction, maybe 15%, are private. But there was this belief that because of problems with public water agencies, that maybe we should turn them over to private entities. And the World Bank was arguing in developing countries, we should let private companies run water agencies because public agencies and governments have been a failure. So that was a bit of a trend. There was a lot of opposition at the time. There were riots in Cochabamba, Bolivia, about an effort to privatize the water system in Bolivia, and people died in those riots. And at the same time, there were a number of public water agencies that saw the threat of privatization and realized that one way they could maintain public control was to improve their operations. And it turns out a well-run public water agency is just as good as a well-run private water agency, and rates tend to be lower for public water agencies, and there are no profits, really. Those monies are reinvested in the public system. And so there is still pressure in some places to privatize water systems, but I think the lesson that we've learned is that a well-run public agency is a better idea.
So we talk on Climate One about the individual and the systemic and ways people can have agency, and I'm curious if there's a water intersection here. I mean, as a water utility member, as somebody who pays water bills, is there something you can do to kind of keep your utility working for you?
Water utilities are sort of a mystery to most people. They turn on their tap and they get clean water and they pay their water bill. And there's not a problem until there's a problem. But public water utilities are public. They have boards of directors, and members of the public can run for boards of directors. And people can go to meetings at their public water utilities or their private water utilities, and they can participate. It's always better not to wait until there's a crisis to get involved.
You mentioned tribes as being one of the groups that doesn't always have great access to water. And in the Southwest, particularly, tribes hold some of the oldest water rights. And they've also been ignored in discussions of water management, like on the Colorado River. and left without access to clean, plentiful water. I think the Biden administration has been working to address some of these wrongs, and I'm curious if you think we've seen any significant changes yet, or maybe some that are to come with these new investments, for tribes specifically.
Well, this is a total contradiction in terms in many ways. Water rights in the West have been given out under something called prior appropriations, first in time, first in right. If you were there first, you were the first farmer to take water out of a river, you had to hire a more senior water right than somebody who came along later. And that first in time, first in right rule, it defines water rights in the Western United States, and yet the tribes who really were here first, obviously, tend not to have senior water rights. They were excluded from those early water rights allocations. There has been an effort in recent years to change that. There have been court cases in recent years that have reallocated some rights back to the tribes, and it is an opportunity to address and reverse some of the wrongs that were done over the last couple of centuries in the West. But a lot more needs to be done in that area.
So one thing that I think is common in the popular imagination when you think of water is water wars, right? And in the book you write that so-called water wars are improbable, unlikely, and historically rare, but violence and armed conflicts associated with water are unambiguously and dramatically on the rise. So can you unpack that for us?
This is something I've worked on for a long time at the Pacific Institute. We maintain something called the Water Conflict Chronology, which is an open source database of conflicts. We don't have wars over water. Wars start for a lot of reasons. Wars start for economic reasons, ideological, religious, political, conflicts over borders, economic reasons. But we do increasingly see violence associated with water resources in three forms. We see water as a trigger of conflict where there's a dispute over access or control of water. We see water or water systems used as weapons during wars, again, wars that start for other reasons. And we see water as a casualty or water systems as casualties of conflicts, again, conflicts that may start for other reasons. And we recently did an analysis of the data in the water conflict chronology and data in history that shows that the number of conflicts over water have increased very dramatically in recent years, in part because of growing pressure over scarce water resources, in part because of a number of conflicts where civilian water systems have been targeted. But that's the way I think about water and conflict.
And how do we get around that? Is that part of the idea of just ensuring everyone has access to water? I mean, it could still be a casualty of war, I suppose.
Well, there are lots of ways around it. Part of the challenge is meeting basic human needs for water. If everyone has access to safe water and sanitation, if everyone has control of water resources in their communities, there's less likely to be, water is less likely to trigger violence and conflict. And we see a lot of conflicts now where there's disputes over control and access to water. International law plays a role in this. International humanitarian law is very explicit, saying that civilian infrastructure should be protected during conflicts, including very explicitly water resources. Institutions have a role to play, better institutions to manage water when it crosses a border, and most rivers worldwide cross borders. And so institutions that can manage transboundary water resources are an important part of that puzzle as well.
Climate, drought, and population growth have cut the Colorado River's flows by about 1/3 in recent years and dropped its reservoirs to historic lows. Recently, after months of negotiations, California, Arizona, and Nevada agreed to take cuts equivalent to about 13% of their part of the river, and they did that rather than having the federal government step in and decide those for them. Those are significant cuts that should temporarily spare Western cities and farms from having their taps run dry, but it is a short-term solution only. So as a Californian, what's your view on this deal and the longer-term outlook for this essential water supply?
I don't think that the agreement that was reached with about a month ago, I guess, really, is going to be sufficient to address the problems on the Colorado. I think it might result in a short-term, a little bit of breathing space, but The problem really, like much of the water in the western United States, like much of the water in rivers around the world, is simply overallocated. We use more water than nature can reliably provide. Until we get water demand under control, there's not much that you can do to reduce the conflicts on the Colorado. We simply demand more water than nature provides.
And so by reductions of demand, I mean, we've already dropped our water use dramatically from what it used to be. I know you can cite a figure probably better than I can on that, but we still have farther to go, basically? Or get people to move back east instead of out west?
So we haven't cut demand on the Colorado that much. And the cuts that we've seen on the Colorado are temporary. They're in response to the shortages that we see. But I think most traditional water politics assumes, oh, these shortfalls are temporary. We'll figure out how to find more supply. The climate will change again, and we'll get wet years on the Colorado. We had sort of a wet year this year on the Colorado, and the reservoir levels are going to go up a little bit. I think that's temporary. Or we'll build a pipeline from the Mississippi River, or we'll desalinate water in the Gulf of California and pump it up to the Colorado River. There's this old style thinking that will solve our water problems with the approaches that we used in the 20th century and in what I describe as the second age of water in the book. And I don't think that's going to be enough.
And then how do we get demand under control?
Well, there are lots of ways. One is, as we've talked about a little bit, we use water more efficiently. We use better irrigation systems. We use better technologies in our industry and our commercial and residential water use to cut our water use, to do the things we want to do more effectively. And that's really important. And we've done a lot in that area, and it's cut our water demand a great deal. But ultimately, in the Colorado, and I think in parts of California, we're going to have to change what we grow and where we grow it. On the Colorado, 80% of the water also goes to agriculture. Mm-hmm. The vast majority of that water goes to grow crops that are fed to animals to produce meat. Again, this is true worldwide as well. A lot of the food that we grow never is consumed by humans, but goes to feed animals. There's going to have to be a fundamental change in people's diets, in what we choose to grow and where we choose to grow it. I think we're going to have to cut how much land is irrigated, not just what we grow, but how much land is irrigated in the Colorado. And I think that's going to be true in parts of California.
So to that point, about $1.2 billion from the Inflation Reduction Act is going to be used to pay cities, tribes, and farmers to temporarily use less water. But that money will run out, and the water needs will continue. I mean, in some places, you're saying we can fallow the land and not use it anymore. When are we going to get to that point where farmers are going to willingly be bought out so that we can use the water for other things?
Yeah, this is a really good point. The agreement that was reached a month ago or so to reduce water use in California and Arizona and Nevada, the southern basin states on the Colorado, was in part encouraged by a big contribution from the federal government, $1.2 billion. I've been arguing that money ought to go to permanent reductions on the Colorado, not temporary cuts to meet shortfalls over the next couple of years, but to invest in better irrigation systems, permanent improvements in irrigation systems or urban water use, to buy out farmers permanently. Mm-hmm. I don't think that's going to happen yet, but ultimately something is going to happen to get farmers to cut their water use, either voluntarily or by mandatory reductions imposed by the states.
Well, as we close here, I just want to share a little bit of my water connection. So I'm from Tucson, Arizona, and our river that flows through town is the Santa Cruz River, one of them, and that's where Tucson was founded. I mean, way before there were Spanish conquistadors that came through. That was the site of indigenous people that lived there for I think it's one of the oldest continuously cultivated parts of the whole United States. And my entire life, that river has been dry. I mean, we call it a river, but it's just an empty, dry riverbed. And a few years ago, the local water utility began putting highly treated wastewater back to recharge the groundwater table there. And it has created this little oasis that's really beautiful. And there is a multi-use path along the river. There are dragonfly populations, there are frogs, there are birds that come. And it's really a short stretch of river. It's not long, but it's really amazing to have water back in this place where it should have been if we hadn't overpumped. So I say all of that to ask you, is there a place like that that you can think of that's special to you and that you've maybe seen go through changes and you're still optimistic about?
That's a wonderful story. And it's an indication, first of all, about how much people care about water. And it's an indication that we can restore some of the damages that we did in the second age of water, which is our age. My wife and I, we're both bird watchers. We love in the winter in California to go up to Northern California to the wildlife refuge where literally hundreds of thousands and millions of birds winter. They come down from the Arctic and from Canada, and they spend the winter in California. But they're incredibly dependent on the wetlands in Northern California that for years have been dried up. The wetlands have been shrinking, the rivers have been shrinking, the farmland has paved over a lot of the wetlands there. But in recent years, we've seen a restoration of some of those wetlands. In the winter, many of the farmers in the northern part of the Central Valley flood their lands in the winter, which actually is beneficial for the farmland themselves, but it restores wildlife and wetland habitat for migrating birds. And it's just wonderful in the winter now to go up and see thousands and thousands of acres of wetlands being restored and millions of birds. And it's good for the soul, and it's good to know that we're moving along this path.
Well, thank you. Peter Gleick is co-founder of the Pacific Institute and author of The 3 Ages of Water: Prehistoric Past, Imperiled Present, and a Hope for the Future. Peter, thank you so much for joining us on Climate One.
Thank you very much.